We are looking at Peter this year. That's where we've started. Last week we looked at this amazing revelation that he had. Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And spent the sermon unpackaging that. And we're going to continue with this passage today because there's so much more in it. Before I get into that though, I want to share something. What happens when you think you're the only one that is right on a doctrine, that is a teaching of the Bible, and everyone else, including the reigning religious paradigm, says you're wrong? Now that could apply to us today in 2024. But this actually happened to Martin Luther back a long time ago. He was born in the 1400s. And it was to do with Catholicism. So he studied at university and was progressing well in his studies in law. But 6 weeks into it, he actually abandoned doing the degree. And the reason being was that he was in a thunderstorm, that he survived, but he had been so terrified in the storm, he'd promised to God that if he survived the storm, he would join a monastery. So he did join a monastery. So be careful what promises you make when you're in storms. That's maybe one little thing to get out of that part, I think. Long story short, because obviously I'm just going to make it short for my sermon, he subsequently studied theology while in the monastery. And in 1517, so that's quite a long time ago, after hearing a Catholic friar who had preached that you could purchase forgiveness of sins by a letter of indulgence, so that's basically paying for it, Martin Luther began to see more and more of the errors of the Catholic Church. So they seriously were the big denomination of the time, and he started seeing more and more, and as he searched the scriptures, the truth just became more and more evident to him, and he got to Romans, and suddenly he could see it's by grace you are saved through faith and not through good works. It's a gift from God. So he wrote to his bishop. He had 95 theses, and he later nailed that. It is thought, because I was reading somewhere, they said, well, we can't prove he did that. It was thought he did nail it to the church, the All Saints Church in Wittenberg on the 31st of October 1517. And that was actually the beginning of what we would call the Reformation of by grace we're saved through faith. They weren't teaching that. They weren't believing that before. There was a lot of false doctrine with the Catholic Church. But it cost Luther. He got excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Later he was intercepted by masked men, and they took him to a castle where he was locked away. And you know what he did there? He actually translated the New Testament from Greek into German. So the thing is, when you do things God's way, you might get in a spot of bother, for want of another word, with man, but it will be worth doing what is right with God, because out of all that, that's what he did. So it's an amazing thing. So we always need to have a love for the truth. So the two questions Jesus asked his disciples last week. First one was, who do men say that I am? We looked at a few different prophets. And then he asked them, who do you say that I am? And we will read from verse 16 and 17, just a little recap. Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And with all of this going on, last week I shared, and I just need to set the scene again, they were in Caesarea Philippi. It was a pagan country. Jesus went out of his way to get the disciples there. There was a big mountain there called Mount Hermon, a huge mountain, and a little brook flowing out of that mountain at that time. I don't believe it's there today. And that little brook flowed into the Jordan River as well. And there would have been little pebbles in that brook too, so it could be a little bit significant. So Jesus then continues talking specifically to Simon Peter. So we're going to continue with verse 18. So this is Jesus talking to him. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. This is a loaded verse. There is so much in this verse. I could have spent 3 weeks just on this verse, but I'm not. Didn't sense I was to sit that long, but hopefully something will speak to you, and you can look further into these things here. So there is much debate over this verse, for starters. For example, Catholicism is built on Peter, who they call Pope Peter, and apparently all the popes are supposed to be related to Peter. And they think Peter is the rock. And look, first reading of that may be what you get when you read it in English. But the Catholicism is wonky theology. And when they've built something on a false foundation, as we know, there is so much in Catholicism that is not right, even today. So they have not started off good, and it's not gone well. But when we look at the Greek for this verse, there's actually different words. So where it says Peter, the Greek word, so you have to just remember this, is Petros. And its gender is masculine, and it actually means a small rock or pebble, like would have been in this little brook coming out of the mountain. And when Jesus says, on this rock he will build, the work is Petra, as opposed to Petros. Petra is actually gender feminine, and it means a massive rock or cliff. So imagine you were there. So let's imagine Peter's here, and I'm being Jesus, and Jesus is saying to Peter, you are Peter, Petros, a little pebble, still significant, but you're a little pebble rock. But I'm Jesus, a massive rock, and on this rock I'm building my church. Does that make sense? It's like a contrast between Peter is a little rock, he's still a rock, but Jesus is the rock. And I think I was praying this morning about it, and I thought of another little example in this is with light. Who is the light of the world? Is it us, or is it Jesus? Or is it both? And on top of that, I thought, my name is Helen. Do you know what Helen means? It means light, actually. So it would be a similar thing. I, Helen, should be light of the world, because in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, don't hide your light under a bushel, you're the light of the world. But I'm not the massive light that Jesus is. So there we go. Another little contrast, so we can understand and see where Catholicism went wrong right at the beginning. And if you've got a wonky foundation, it is not going to stand. So Peter is like a small pebble compared to Jesus, the rock, who's massive, immovable, unshakable and strong, which I'm glad about, because Jesus is God. He's God's son. He's perfect, and we can rely on him. Also in the Old Testament, wherever the rock is mentioned symbolically, because obviously there's times where it's talking about a rock, like when Moses got water out of the rock. But when it is symbolically to do with the rock, it's always referring to the Messiah. So we're just going to look at a couple of verses. You could do your own research. 2 Samuel 22, verse 2. The Lord is my rock. How clear is that? The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. We sing a song about that too, don't we? What about Psalm 62, verse 2? He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defence. I shall not be greatly moved. That's talking about God. He's our rock. How good is that? And there's a really good verse in the New Testament that makes it very clear. It is actually referring to Moses when they were in the wilderness. And this is from 1 Corinthians 10 verse 4. And it says, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Doesn't get much clearer than that, does it? So if you've been hesitant, well, Peter's name's Rock. Is Jesus building the church on Peter? Peter's part of the building, the foundation, the apostles and the prophets. Jesus is the cornerstone. So again, we have Jesus, the rock, but Peter was still a rock, very significant in the early church. So thankfully the church is not built on fallible Peter, as we have seen. He's a little pebble, but on the rock, the Messiah, Jesus. Also in this verse, we have the first mention of church in the New Testament. It says, my church. So again, we have to look at the Greek for this. It's ecclesia. And the most simple definition of the word ecclesia is called out ones. So if you're a Christian here today, what are you? Ecclesia. What does that mean? You're called out ones. It can actually apply to a gathering as well. So here we're in a gathering, but we're called out ones. If you're called out from something, what does that mean? You're going to be different from where you were. So we're called out from the world into the ecclesia, the church. It means that we're going to be different. We should not be going around sinning like the world is sinning. Because then it's like, well, you're no different. I've heard non-Christians say, well, I know Christians, but they're no different to me. As called out ones, reflecting Jesus, the light and the rock, we need to be different. We belong to Jesus. So church, ecclesia, is not bricks and mortar. Again, the Catholic Church went very wrong with that. Look at all their amazing cathedrals. But that's not what's important, is it? That's not what church is. It's just a building. New Testament was never about buildings. It's about the people of God. It's not about institution or organisation even. It's the people of God, the ecclesia, the ones who belong to Jesus, the ones who have been called out. So how do you become part of his ecclesia, his church? Is it giving lots of money? No. Is it actually going to church every week? Well, no, that's not how you come to be part of the ecclesia. Is it doing good deeds? No, it's not. We know the basis of our faith, you must be born again in Romans by grace. That means you didn't deserve it. By grace you are saved through faith. It's a gift from God. We need to continue to preach the gospel at the called out ones, the power of the gospel, because we don't know who else God is calling out to him. And that's where we have to keep sowing seed for harvest. And the gospel is such a powerful message. You know, in Hobart, many people, especially under the age of probably 30, have never heard the gospel. It's good to remember we need to be willing and available to preach the gospel. Christ crucified and buried and rose again on the third day. Why? Because we're sinful, because we've all fallen short of God's standard of perfection. So I just want to read verse 18 again, because there's a lot in that, so we'll keep going. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock, so you are Petros, little rock, and on this rock, Jesus, Petra, I will build my church, ecclesia, the called out ones, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the gates of Hades, and it's actually, because it's in the Old Testament, this expression, is an idiom, an expression, and do you know what it means? It actually means physical death. So if you look at what has happened with his church, his ecclesia, over time, starting with the apostles, Many of them were martyred. Then, as the gospel went forth further, Christians were taken to Rome and put in the lion's den and eaten alive. And even today, there are many, many martyrs. So what this is saying is the gates of hell, death, will not prevail against Christ's church, the ecclesia. Death will not prevail. And it's interesting, we're just going to look at in a little moment, Jesus talks about his death. And so even his death was not going to be the end of the church. It was the establishing of it, actually. So this is all very interesting, isn't it? So verse 19, and I will give you, so this is to Peter, so I'm looking at it in context. This is specifically to Peter. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So keys represent authority. All through the Old Testament you can find that about keys. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, in the context of this scripture, when you bear in mind the Jewish culture, and I've got a book by Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who is a Messianic Jew who understands the Jewish culture and things behind this. This is to do with things that are permitted and not permitted. So it's a little bit of Greek and stuff today. It's more of a teaching sermon, but it helps to establish our faith so we can answer questions. When people say, what does that mean? You'll have the understanding. So Jesus was giving Peter the authority to bind and loose. It was probably to do with prohibiting and permitting things according to the law. And we see that with Peter, that things that were not previously allowed were allowed. On the day of Pentecost, Peter was the one released. He preached that amazing sermon. People got saved. What about going to the Gentiles? Who went to the Gentiles with the authority? He changed what was not allowed to what was allowed. It was Peter that went to the Gentiles, Acts 10, when he went to Cornelius' house. So this is an amazing thing. Peter's given this authority by Jesus because Peter, as an apostle, is part of the foundation of the church, the ecclesia. He was also given the divine revelation. Nobody else was given that at the time, that Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But with all that revelation and authority he's given, he didn't understand everything. And I think this is very important for us to know. Because Jesus went on then to explain his upcoming suffering and death. And Peter would not accept it. Let's read from verse 21 to 22 of Matthew 16. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." So where it says Peter rebuked Jesus, it's actually in the Greek is implying manhandling. Like Peter is manhandling Jesus, who he's just declared you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's manhandling, he's rebuking him, he's telling him off. How can he be 1 minute so full of God, this revelation and given this authority with the keys, and then he's rebuking the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? How quickly Peter forgot who Jesus is. How quickly he forgot what he'd seen and heard, not just then, but leading up to it with the preaching, the healing, the miracles, the deliverance. Peter was actually deceived. He understood truth 1 minute, and I'm not sure how much after, but he was deceived the next. And the thing is, with deception, you don't realise you're deceived. Put up your hand here if anyone knows they're deceived. Well, nobody's put their hand up. Well, that's interesting. But do you think we possibly could be deceived on some things? But the thing is, with deception, you don't know. Peter didn't know he was deceived. So we too are vulnerable to deception, and probably even more so than Peter. Why is that? Because we're living in the last days. And I think the biggest warning to God's people in the last days is about deception. We'll just look at a couple of verses to do with this. 1 Peter 4, verse 1. Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times, that's now, that's us, some will depart from the faith. That means they had faith, but they'll depart from it, giving heed, listening to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. That means there's specifically spirits that can deceive you. What if you've got one sat on top of your head and it's afflicting you, it's deceiving you? It's very serious. End days. This is what is going to happen. We are warned of deception, and we need to be alert to the devices of the devil. And Matthew 24, verse 24, this is Jesus speaking. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. That means just because there's signs and wonders going on doesn't mean it's from God. False Christ, false prophets. Are there any around in 2024? There are lots. There are many. And they're often running big churches. And if you start listening to their doctrine, you'll know things aren't quite right. Wonky doctrine like the Catholic Church. When people start saying you've got, the more money you give, the greater prophecy you're going to get given. That is not right, is it? That's the false church. That happens. Plenty of times, plenty of places. So if deception's going to be big, well, firstly, we have to be alert to that. You need to be alert to the devices of the devil, because he is a roaring lion. He's a sneak. He can disguise himself as an angel of light. So that means you have to test everything, hold on to what is true. You actually really need to have a love for the truth and be willing to be corrected. Who likes being corrected? Mostly we don't. But if you set yourself apart and say, well, what I know is true and nobody can tell me it's not, you need to be careful, because even in that you could be deceived. Having said that, Martin Luther was pretty much alone in what he saw, and it was true. So we have to be very careful that we are keeping close to the Lord, that we're open to correction, that we're desiring truth, and not just stuff to tickle our ears. And just because you've had revelation that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, doesn't mean you're necessarily right on everything. Because just like Peter fell into error, deception, so can we. Peter needed correcting, and Jesus didn't pussyfoot around sweetly in his correction of Peter. What did he say? Verse 23. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, so he's now talking to Peter saying, "Get behind me, Satan," looking at Peter. "You are an offence to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Could you imagine a pastor in Hobart in 2024 saying, "Get behind me, Satan," when they're bringing correction? Most people are going to walk out. But the thing is, Jesus, he's God. He's the Son of God. He was spot on with what he said. And he didn't water it down down, or, oh, Peter, now sit down, have a little chat with me because you're not quite right. He called it out strongly. And he actually rebuked Peter in doing this. And he said, Satan's behind this. This was a satanic attack that happened on Peter. It was Satan that was behind it. Saying, Peter, you're an offence to me, is like saying, Peter, you've done something so wrong. This is not of God. It's bad. You're thinking about man and not God. But Peter didn't know that. If you look at what Peter was doing, he was caring for Jesus. If we were there, we may have done the same, actually. Because when you love someone, you don't want them to hurt or to suffer. But the thing is, Peter had a human perspective instead of a God perspective. He wasn't being mean. He wanted the best for Jesus, but his best was no suffering. Whereas Jesus was called to suffer and die. It was God's way. God's way isn't always the easy way. God's way isn't always the smooth, feel-good, nice way. Sometimes God's way for us is to suffer, and for those who've been martyred to die as well. This was the way to the cross of Jesus, that he would die not for nothing, but for the salvation of many. Jesus took this road, not the easy, safe road, the hard road of suffering, because he loved the Father and he loved us. And it was the road of obedience. Obedience to his Father. And that's what we need to do too. We need to obey the Father. And it's very interesting what Jesus said to his disciples straight after he's rebuked Peter, because Peter was wrong, because Jesus did have to suffer. Verse 24 and 25, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him, what? Have a party? Ask for anything you want, you're just going to get it. No, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. That's the walk, the life of obedience. There's nothing there about it being easy, but the Lord is a blessing God too. He actually gives us so much blessings, even though there may be hard things. And it says, for whosoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And this is the way of the kingdom of God. It's topsy-turvy to the world's way. That actually when you lay your life down and say, God, I'm giving my life up to serve you, that's actually when you find it. It really is. And it's an amazing thing. So you have the choice to choose self-fulfillment or self-denial. They're opposites. Self-fulfillment, you'll end up destroying yourself. Self-denial, you'll find your life. It might not always be easy, but it will be what God has for you. When you're led by the Holy Spirit, like we saw the other week, you won't just be led into the easy places, but sometimes you will. There are green pastures and still waters, but there's that valley of the shadow of death that you may have to walk through. There may be trials and tests, persecution, opposition, but there's still joy in those places. How do you get this joy? It's a fruit of the Spirit. And I'll just read Hebrews 12 verse 2, because even Jesus had this joy before he died. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus had joy because he knew what he was doing would lead to us being with him forever. And just like Martin Luther, he went through hell, really, to be excommunicated and looked down on by everybody and then basically kidnapped. But look what he did. He changed things. One man changed the ecclesia, which is amazing. So in conclusion, Jesus promised to build his church, his ecclesia, which belongs to him. It's his. He will build it. We're only small here today, but it's still ongoing. He will build it. We don't have to build it. It's not our job. He will build his ecclesia, his church, on himself, because he is a strong, large rock. So if you're ever feeling hurt or in a hard place, remember the rock, Jesus. He's immovable. He's our foundation. And as Christians, we stand on this rock that cannot be shaken or moved. Are you living daily like someone who believes Jesus is the Messiah, the rock, the immovable one? It changes how you live if you really believe it. Are you walking in the Spirit, not the flesh, seeking to obey the Father while counting it all joy no matter what? And remember how quickly Peter fell from divine revelation to deception. Very quickly. Deception can be deadly. Like all Catholics over the years who actually aren't saved, many of them, some have obviously been born again, but many are not. They've taken on the name Catholic. They've been sprinkled with water as a baby and they think they're saved. No, you must be born again. It's a work of the Spirit. By grace, you are saved through faith. So we need to keep close to the Lord. Be like the Bereans, the book of Acts, who when they were hearing the teachings of the gospel, searched out the scriptures for themselves. Do that. Keep around others. Iron sharpen iron. Have accountability. So we talk with each other. We can make sure we're not veering off track. Read his word. Draw near to him and he'll draw near to you. Because Jesus is the immovable, unshakable, massive rock in whom we can safely trust. Amen. Thank you for listening. That sermon was a labour of love. I've spent